What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Tough draft day choices today, breaking down James Conner and Joe Mixon. What I'll be doing in these videos is I'll break down each player's projection that I have for them, their upside, their floor, and their risk, because that's ultimately what you should be thinking about with each and every one of your picks. And then I'll ultimately decide which one would I choose if I were on the clock. And can we get a like for this new series? I want to do an in-depth breakdown each and every Saturday, but I gotta know if you guys like them or not. So if we can get 500 likes on this video, I'll know that you guys are enjoying this content. But let's start with the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day, the answer was Rob Gronkowski, and it was answered pretty quickly by Drake Goetten, something like that. Drake, you got it right first. Today's stat, over the last 8 weeks of the season, last year, among quarterbacks with at least 7 starts, which was most quarterbacks, but I just didn't want to include someone who came in for a few plays. So at least 7 starts over the last 8 weeks. Who had the highest completion percentage when under pressure? So when pressure's in their face, who had the highest completion percentage over the last 8 weeks of last season? And a reminder, you can download my rankings and my projections that I talk about in this video, although you only get 2 in this video, at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. We offer the cheapest draft package in the entire industry. It has more than enough information for you to dominate your leagues. And with that, let's hop into this breakdown. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about, like I said, the projection, the upside, the floor, and the risk with each player. I'm going to start with one, go to the other, and then ultimately we'll come together at the end and we'll have a decision. After looking at all the points in each of these guys, who would I take? That's going to come down to half PPR scoring, but I'll let you know in each of the videos if it's different under standard versus half point or versus like PPR or anything. But I'll tell you right now, for this one, doesn't matter the scoring format. So standard, half point, full point, doesn't matter. The decision will be the same at the end. But let's start with James Conner. And if you guys saw the top 10 projection video, and you hear me talk all the time, the projections change. It has changed on James Conner. So I'll put on the screen the new projection for that James Conner has, and it's 239 carries, a little over 1,000 yards, 1,079 yards, and 10.6 touchdowns, with 54 receptions for 479 yards and a little under 1 receiving touchdowns. That's good for 278 PPR points. That's a good projection. And the upside for Conner is basically that they use one back, like they really always have. And if that's the case, if they use one back, they use him like they did last season for most of the season, then he needs to be viewed, in the same way Le'Veon Bell was. Because if you look at some of his advanced metrics, he has produced just as much, if not better, in some categories than Le'Veon Bell ever did with this offense. This is an offense that's extremely friendly for fantasy running backs. So James Conner, if he got the full workload in this offense, he's got to be viewed in the same way that Bell was. And while they're going to score less points, in the post-AB era of this offense, they're still going to be elite. So Conner posted 13 total touchdowns in 13 games last season. That's not what we should expect. That's a little bit more than we should expect, even if he's getting that bell cow role. But he's still going to produce for fantasy purposes. He averaged 19.6 half PPR points per game last season, although he averaged 23.5 PPR points per game in the first 8 games, and then 12.8 in his final 5 games. He had 5 100-yard rushing performances in the first 8 weeks. He had 0 games over 65 rushing yards in the final 5 weeks. And it wasn't because of the defenses he was playing. 2 of those final 5 weeks were against defenses he had dominated earlier in the season, and the other 3 were against average to below average rush defenses. So part of it was likely due to being banged up. He'd suffered a few injuries later in the season, but it also shows that a lot of his production does come from the touchdowns. I'm not saying he doesn't get a ton of yardage, because remember, he had the 5 100-yard rushing games. He's pretty good in the passing game, but some of his monster performances were off like 2 and 3 touchdown games, which is not something that you should be reliant on. You shouldn't be looking at that and be like, oh yeah, the dude's going to score. He scored 13 last year. Well, if he plays full 16, he's going to score 16 this year. No, that's not something you should expect. Touchdowns are a little bit more random than 1 per game that he was getting. And while he was out, Jalen Samuels showed that he's capable of receiving work both on the ground and through the air. So he was a capable running back while James Conner was missing. And it's worth noting that they did split time basically down the middle in Week 17, which was a must-win game for the Steelers last season, even when Connor returned, although it can be argued, he was returning from an injury and he just couldn't hold up to the full workload. We're not inside that training staff. We don't know the discussions that are going on. That is honestly likely that they were just like, hey, you can't give him 70 snaps. Like, he's got to be in this 35 to 40 range. Connor does have a solid floor. Like, I bring up that Jalen Samuels might steal work, but even if that happens, Connor's going to be good. He's going to get you points. This isn't a situation, I guess, like Royce Freeman and Philip Lindsay last year. Like, if you view that and you're like, oh, Philip Lindsay might take work. If you took work from Royce Freeman last season, that means Royce Freeman's barely usable. That's not this situation. Even if Jalen Samuels comes in, you'll still be able to start James Conner, because Connor will still get a good amount of carries, he'll still get a good amount of receiving work, and he's still going to score touchdowns. So ultimately the risk, if we're looking at this guy, he's like a mid-second round pick, what's the risk with him? It's twofold. It's what I just talked about. It's the Jalen Samuels sees a significant workload. My projection right now has Connor with 65% of the team carries, Samuels with 25%, and then Connor with 11% total team market share for targets, and then Samuels with 5% total team market share for targets. The second bit of risk is that the offense regresses from what we saw last season. They ran the fourth most plays per game, and they had the fourth most touchdowns per game. And I'm not saying that they should have produced less than they did last season. I'm saying AB's gone. And they were really good, and they ran a lot of plays. There's a chance they're the 9th most plays per game and the 9th most touchdowns per game. That's well within their range of outcomes. And if that happens, it does hurt James Conner. So since they could absolutely see regression there, that's a risk from a play volume and just an opportunity standpoint. So what it comes down to with drafting James Conner is, what do you think happens between those two bits of risk? If you think that James Conner is going to see more than 65% of the carries and that the offense is going to stay elite, then you should be drafting him at his current ADP because you think he's undervalued. But if you think Jalen Samuels sees more work and the offense takes a step back, then maybe you should just not take Conner because it's not worth it, because there are so many good running backs still available and some really elite wide receivers. So that's the breakdown of James Conner, and I'll bring him obviously back up when we talk about which one I take. But let's hop into Joe Mixon. So Joe Mixon, you guys didn't see my projection on him in the top 10 because he wasn't in the top 10. So here's his projection. 259 carries for a little over 1,100 yards, 10.5 touchdowns with 54 receptions, 443 yards, and 0.7 touchdowns. Comes out to 277.9 PPR points. That is 0.3 points less than James Conner. So in some of these breakdowns, I'm sure I'm going to bring up the projection. It's going to be like, hey, there's a 30-point gap. That's something we need to look into. This is a 0.3 point gap, which is nothing. I mean, these guys' projection, just their average outcome is the same, which makes sense because they're going right next to each other in draft. So at least for this comparison, we can't lean on the projection for any sort of analysis. The upside with Joe Mixon is what we saw last season, but for a full 16 weeks. He only played 14 games last season. Pull that out to 16, and I mean, he was awesome, and also with an expanded pass game role. We saw him have work in the passing game, but there's definitely a chance that he sees more of a role in the passing game this season. Last season, he finishes the running back 10 in PPR scoring, and he was 9th in points per game. And if you look at his game log from last season, there's definitely opportunity for him to get more carries. He had just 5 games with more than 20 carries and 7 games with less than 15 carries. He came with a nice floor in the receiving game, generating 3 or more receptions in 8 of his games, but there's plenty of room to expand on those numbers. He was given 73% of the team's running back carries and targets last season, but the Bengals were 3rd lowest in terms of plays per game last season. Marvin Lewis is finally not the head coach anymore, so perhaps they can step it up a bit. Perhaps they can finally not underproduce every season. Reports are that Mixon will be used a lot, but we don't need any sort of reports to know that. Remember who Joe Mixon is. He's starting his 3rd season as a pro this year. He's about to turn 23 in July. He posted a 93rd percentile height-adjusted speed score, a 77th percentile SparkX score, a 90th percentile college yards per carry, an 81st percentile college target market share, and he's most comparable to Ezekiel Elliott on playerprofiler.com. They did draft 2 running backs in the draft, and I'm sure you're going to hear people bring that up this summer. They're going to go, they kept Bernard, they brought out these 2 running backs on, there's risk there that these guys take work. No. Trevion Williams is likely the Bernard replacement, but, he's not even all that good. And then Rodney Anderson looks like he has raw talent, but the dude's coming off a torn ACL, and he's never healthy. So could Rodney Anderson challenge him down the line? I guess, but it would take an injury to Joe Mixon for Anderson to get any real work this season, and there's just no way. There's just no way those guys pose any sort of threat to Joe Mixon's job. This is Joe Mixon's backfield, and he's going to get all of the work that he can handle. So the only risk with him is injury. And if we look at Sports Injury Predictor, they do have him at slightly elevated injury risk, but there's no previous injuries that give me any sort of concern over his health, and he's still young. He's played 28 out of 32 possible games in his career, so I really don't view him as risky at all. Realistically, he's a running back that's going to get a lot of workload, so if he gets hurt, it's because he was a running back in the National Football League that got a lot of carries, so people hit him a lot. There's going to be risk with every single one of these running backs that gets the ball so many times per game, but we want him to get the ball so many times per game because that's how you score fantasy points. So I don't view him as risky at all. If you listen to this analysis, you probably know who I'm going to pick now. My decision has to be Joe Mixon. When I started this breakdown, I had James Conner ranked ahead of Joe Mixon. But after looking at it, I've moved Mixon up to my running back 9 and James Conner down to running back 11. And the reason is all to do with risk and reward. You hear risk reward a lot. And typically people bring up risk reward when it's like, hey, this guy's really risky. It's kind of like a Todd Gurley, I guess, but more like that Will Fuller, that Sammy Watkins mold where you're like, I get it. There's risk. But look at Sammy Watkins. If Tyreek Hill is out this season, which actually kind of looking like he might not be, which is ridiculous, but Sammy Watkins, right? Let's say Tyreek Hill is out and this dude stays healthy for 16 weeks. Risk reward there. The dude can explode. This dude could be a monster this season. I look at risk reward in this situation and I say, well, what's my reward with James Conner? Because he is more risky. He does have a chance for the offense to regress and see less plays and less touchdowns. He does have a chance for running back to come in and take a workload, and that's not something we have to be concerned about with Mixon. If anything, it's the opposite. He's going to stay at that same workload, but they're probably going to run more plays and probably going to score more touchdowns. So I say, okay, well, if Conner pays off, what's the reward? There is none, because it's the exact same upside as Joe Mixon. So why would I spend my pick on James Conner when I can get a guy with a higher floor and the exact same upside that's not as risky? I preach safety in the first 4 rounds. So even if Conner, you think, has a slightly higher ceiling, let's just say you think this dude's got running back 1 upside, like overall running back 1 upside, because obviously he has being a running back 1. Let's say you think he has more upside. I preach safety in the first 4 rounds, and the more I look at it, Conner is a slightly risky pick where he's going in drafts. So for that reason, I gotta go with Joe Mixon. So Joe Mixon wins the first episode of Tough Draft Day Choices. And remember, you can download my rankings and these projections that I talk about at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. And remember to leave a like for our new series that we will hopefully be posting each and every Saturday. But that's the end of this one. I hope you guys did enjoy. If you did, how about we hit that like button? How about we subscribe if we are new? And thanks for watching.